our Chief Executive, Liz Ballard, and she's going to give a presentation about Nature Recovery Sheffield. So if you keep yourselves on mute just throughout the presentation, and then you can ask questions at the end, or if you don't want to ask a question, just type it in the chat box and I can read it out to Liz at the end. I'm Rebecca, by the way, a membership officer at the Trust. So I think that's everyone here so far, so I'll pass you over to Liz.
Sorry. Hi everyone. Thank you ever so much for joining us for this Nature Natters. So I've got quite a serious subject we're going to talk about this lunchtime. So, but I hope you find it really interesting, and I hope that you'll be inspired as well to take action and to help with this work that we're doing. So I'm just going to minimize this a little and just see Rebecca. Okay, so as many of you will know, because you're well-informed people, I think, nature is in trouble, and we have a real challenge on our hands because we're seeing a loss of nature that's unprecedented. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit now about some of the work and some of the issues at quite a kind of global level almost, and then bring it back down to the UK, and then think about our local patch in Sheffield and in Rotherham, and talk about what we can do. And then at the end, as Rebecca says, we'll kind of have some time for some questions and discussion. So to start off with then, just that world view. There's been a number of reports from the United Nations. They do these incredible reports that draw on massive data sets about species across the world and across different groups of species. So right from mammals to insects to plants to lesser species. So right across the board, and they pull all these data sets together and they produce these amazing reports. And there's a couple of reports they produced a few years ago which sort of analysed the current situation of biodiversity across the world. And you can search these online, so if you're really keen, you know, type it into Google. These inter-policy reports, and this is just something that really stood out to me. It talks about biodiversity and the diversity with species, between species and of ecosystems, is declining faster than at any time in human history. So this is about the different species that we see, the different types of species we see, that's biodiversity, and also how those species relate to different networks and systems. So they all kind of relate and interrelate to each other. And that is declining faster than it has at any time in human history. So it's really unprecedented times that this report demonstrated. And many of you may be aware that in 2010, the UN set targets, 20 targets to halt the decline of global biodiversity by 2020. And probably at that time, they thought that, you know, that was a decade to do something by, and that would be, you know, 10 years to achieve something that was really kind of going to make a difference. But today we only have about 6 of those that have been partially met across the world. So the UN have looked back over the last 10 years, and literally 6 of these 20 targets for biodiversity have been partially met, and the rest have failed. So pretty depressing picture in some respects. And the UK didn't do much better. We probably achieved about 4 of those targets, and those only partially as well. So the UK was not particularly better than any other country in the world. And we know from the State of Nature report that the UK is seen as one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. So it's not that we're particularly standing out as a good example of how to look after biodiversity. We are not seen as having an abundance of nature. So, and again, if you want to see that State of Nature report, that's available online. So closer to home, to look at and a picture, and then just thinking a bit more closely and thinking about Sheffield and Rotherham, but particularly concentrating on Sheffield a little bit more today. So in terms of, oh, I'm just getting a little note about my connection, so I'm sure Rebecca will shout if it's sticking or anything. So a little bit closer to home, looking at Sheffield, we produced something called the State of Nature report in 2018, which was a really kind of intense project. It took 2 years to develop, and it drew on a lot of data from across the city. It was quite a challenging project, and we found that we didn't really have a lot of the data that we needed to really understand the state of nature. And some of you might remember this report. It was we had a big launch, and some of you may remember Angela Smith, who's no longer here. She's moved away, but she was the MP at the time. She helped us launch this really important report, and it gave us a bit of a picture of what was going on in Sheffield. But really, kind of one of the things that I really took from it was that we're just not really collecting the data that we need to even understand what's going on in our local patch. And we've really tried to sort of change that ever since with our project Data for Nature, which some of you will perhaps already be involved with, about how we collect more data and learn much more about our local wildlife and the local habitats. So we've got that kind of baseline, not a brilliant baseline, but it was a good baseline. And it highlighted a whole range of things. And it showed that really the issues that we're dealing with in Sheffield really are the same as the issues that we're dealing with in Rotherham, but they're also the same as people are dealing with across the UK and globally. There's a real resonance about the same themes coming up repeatedly at a local level, regional level, national level, and a global level. And so, for example, one of those themes, one of those drivers of loss of biodiversity is fragmentation. And what do we mean by that? Well, we mean that, you know, there used to be a much bigger area for nature, set aside for nature, not purposely, but it just by so happened that it was. And so, for example, in Sheffield and Rotherham, there's this kind of picture here demonstrates it quite well. This is an ancient woodland map, and these woodlands would have been connected across the piece many years ago. And we've in the past, some of you have helped us really meet the challenge of trying to save Smithy Wood. Well, Smithy Wood was part of a kind of big woodland that stretched around Sheffield, and Greenough Woods as part of that, and then it went on into Rotherham and into Thorpe Pesley and beyond, and that would have all been one woodland. And wouldn't it have been wonderful to have seen it at that time? But now we see this fragmentation, this breaking up of this habitat, which is really destructive and leaves these really quite small sites that are very isolated, and that makes them much less valuable for species. Species thrive in space, so they need more space. They need connectivity, connection between different sites. So this is a real challenge, and you know, we've kind of really tried to campaign for these local woodlands to be saved, and Greenough is on the left, and Greenough Woods, our nature reserve, is on the left, and Smithy Wood is on the right. And so you can really see that there is a lot of similarity between these woodlands and how important they are. So the other driver of fragmentation, or one of the drivers of fragmentation, is of course development. And Smithy Wood, it was a particular planning application, and more recently there's been this proposal to, for example, to build houses on this site at Althorpe. And it's not to say that we should be against all development by any means, but it has been critical in where it's located in terms of how it impacts on sites and their connections. And the story of Althorpe's interesting because if you don't know it already, it's effectively a site that's been allocated for housing for 30 years or more by the local plan for Sheffield. And finally, it's been brought to market. But in the meantime, there's sort of really quite poor agricultural land that had just really been left, and was really quite boring, has kind of rewilded itself, and it is now really just bordering on local wildlife site value. And indeed, we have made the case in trying to oppose this planning application that it's actually already local wildlife site status or very close to, and really should be saved and designated. And it borders Dyke, which is a small conduit of ancient woodland, which is starting to spill out into this site. So there's a real opportunity here actually for biodiversity, but currently this is down for planning development and is fragmenting up further this habitat around Sheffield. So also the other kind of theme, as well as fragmentation and development, sort of habitat loss that we see locally and nationally, it is to do with how habitats are degraded. So it's the quality of the habitat and how well it's been looked after. And without wishing to upset anyone who may be on the call, this is an aerial view of the moorlands that are to the west of Sheffield. And you can see here the kind of patchwork of different habitats that we kind of see across the area. And basically the area is so kind of fragmented from the nature of how it's managed that it's really quite an intensive way of managing that land, and therefore has an impact on the biodiversity that it supports. So how we manage land is another theme. So we've got fragmentation, development, loss of habitat, but then we've got the habitat that we've retained. How well are we looking after it? Is it good enough? Is it great for nature? And in this example, I would say no, it isn't. We aren't seeing the biodiversity that we should see in these sort of habitats to the west of Sheffield. And another theme that is seen across globally, regionally, nationally, is about how we look after wildlife itself and how we look after different species. And if we have hunted or overfished, or kind of crops that we too intensively manage, then that obviously has an impact on biodiversity as well. And so, you know, we see that we have species. This is the mountain hare, for example, which is a Peak District species, and it is currently culled and seen as a pest locally, but is indeed a species that we would consider worth conserving. So, you know, again, on our doorstep, we have these issues about persecution of different wildlife, and you know, birds of prey. Many of you will be aware of that also. And then, you know, in the urban context, we have species such as the hedgehog, which has all but disappeared from urban areas, and we see very diminished numbers of hedgehogs, for example, now. And it's sort of a perfect storm for the hedgehog. It's this mixture of kind of habitat loss, lack of connectivity between habitats, so because of roads or because of garden fences, which is why we talk about putting in hedgehogs highways, but also just some of it's unknown as to why they're declining so much. Could be climate change as well, could it be loss of their food source? So there's lots of issues that seem to be impacting on them, and we see that big decline in Sheffield, and that was in the State of Nature report that I mentioned earlier for 2018 for Sheffield. We saw that. So there's this sort of great picture infographic from the Mammal Society that gives that sort of overview of where our species are, particularly high mammals in the UK, and this is reflected very much in Sheffield and in Rotherham as well. We see the same picture. So it's a loss of species as well. Another theme that we see globally as well as nationally as well as locally is this issue of invasive species, and we have our fair share of these in Sheffield and Rotherham. So for example, this slide just shows a few of those examples. So we have the white-clawed crayfish and the American signal crayfish, and these two kind of don't fare very well together. The American signal crayfish has effectively escaped into our watercourses and all but wiped out our native white-clawed crayfish. And we think there is one or two populations hanging on the west of Sheffield, one of them in our nature reserve, but pretty well monitoring shows that pretty well most of our other streams and watercourses, there's very little sign of the white-clawed crayfish left, which is very sad. And indeed, the release of mink some years ago from some of the fur farms that resulted in them escaping into watercourses. Watercourse, a perfect transport system for species, and unfortunately it was a perfect transport system for the mink, managed to sort of outcompete in terms of food and habitat the native otter, but it also enjoyed preying on our native water vole. So we've seen a massive decline in water vole, and it's good to see. There's a good news story that otter is coming back, seems to have made its way back into the water system, probably in part because the habitat's improved, but the American mink has preyed on water vole, and that was thought that the Environment Agency very recently were about to declare it extinct from South Yorkshire, but actually we said no, there are still one or two populations hanging on, just about hanging on the west of Sheffield, and we're kind of trying to really protect them and look after them, because once they're gone, that could be it. But if we could retain them, then we might be able to actually extend their populations and reintroduce them to other areas. But there's only any point in doing that if they are kind of protected from some of the mink. And we think the locations where they're surviving is because they're a bit higher than where some of the mink is found. So invasive non-natives is an issue, but then another common thread of disease and pests. And again, we see that in Sheffield and Rotherham. This ash dieback, Clara ash dieback, has reached Sheffield and Rotherham. We're now seeing significant numbers of trees at risk and being removed. It's been coming up from the south and the east, and the Peak District has already had issues with it, and now it's kind of reached Sheffield and Rotherham, when we're starting to see those trees being removed wholesale. So as some of you may remember from many years ago, where we maybe had those beautiful mature elm trees across our landscape and then they all disappeared, we are facing a very kind of sad prospect of seeing all our mature ash trees disappear across the landscape as well. And so we kind of have to think about how we conserve and look after our landscape and how resilient it will be in the future, responding to these diseases and pests, and things like oak processionary moth are on the rise, and Phytophthora has just also been identified in some trees on the edge of Sheffield as well. So we've got some real challenges ahead. And all of this, of course, is exacerbated by climate change, and the State of Nature report for Sheffield refers to this temperature graph for Weston Park Museum, which has recorded the temperatures and rainfall, sun hours, etc. in Sheffield for some years, and you can see that it just really demonstrates this trend that we're all increasingly aware of, but it just kind of, I think it brings it home really well. And the themes that I've mentioned here about habitat fragmentation, habitat loss, the kind of disconnect between different core sites, and how that impacts on wildlife and species, their ability to thrive, the kind of persecution of some species, the over kind of harvesting of species and crops, and intensification of kind of crop management and farming, and the concerns about the rise in pests and diseases and invasive species, that they're all exacerbated by climate change. They make it harder for our species to thrive. So we kind of have these challenges that are exactly the same locally as they are nationally and globally. And I think, you know, we can talk about why is this important, why isn't it important? And of course, there's kind of perhaps two ways of looking at this, and it depends a little bit on your own worldview. So there's one worldview, which is that this is important because we have a responsibility, we are part of nature, and therefore we should look after the world around us. It supports us, and we are part of it, and we have a kind of moral obligation to look after the natural world around us. It's one school of thought, and the other school of thought that you might, your worldview might kind of feel more relevant is that is to think about all the services and benefits that we receive from the natural environment. So we increasingly call this natural capital, and this is a map of the natural capital of Sheffield, not Rotherham in this case, just Sheffield, with the Sheffield Lakes sort of area highlighted. And this map demonstrates or indicates the different benefits, and it's based on a lot of kind of quite detailed modelling that's done, and it looks at the different ecosystem services or different benefits that people receive from the habitats around us. And so, for example, this is things like cleaner air, cleaner water, natural flood risk management, carbon storage, access and recreation, health and well-being, those kind of things. So different habitats kept well, good for conservation, good for biodiversity. They tend to offer more benefits to people, and so you can see that there's a lot of opportunity in Sheffield to really improve the ecosystem services that our habitats offer. And really we can turn this into, if we want to, we can turn this into monetary values. So how these ecosystem services, how much they would cost us if we had to replace them in some other way. And you may have heard of stories of in China where a lot of the insect population has disappeared, and they now need to hand pollinate some of their fruit trees and crops because of the loss of the insects, and there's a cost to that. So it's thinking about the cost of, you know, if we didn't have the clean air and water that we need to survive, and the impact that would have on us, how much would that cost? It would be pretty significant for us to try and resolve those issues. So we can look at things in monetary terms, and we can look at things in kind of philosophical and moral terms. And so, you know, I hope I kind of haven't depressed you too much there. You know, some people will look at this and think, well, you know, what can we do? It's such a massive task. And, you know, there is a kind of acceptance now that we are in the 6th mass extinction. Even David Attenborough has now said it. I think that makes it, unfortunately, a kind of statement of fact. The data is there. It's so critical to indicating that we are in that situation with not only a reduction in the number, in the diversity of species, but a reduction in the abundance or the amount of population of particular species as well. Everything is contracting. So what can we do? And I suppose I always kind of go back to a very kind of traditional phrase that has been around for a very long time, which is thinking about, well, you know, what's in our control? What can we particularly do that makes a difference? And acting locally, but thinking globally is exactly kind of what I'm talking about here with you today. And, you know, so what are the things that we can do? And of course, there are organisations which we work with which think very globally, and you know, by all means, you know, you may wish to sign up and take action with organisations that work kind of at that global scale and do things that kind of benefit biodiversity and habitats in other countries. But just to think more today specifically about our local patch. So one message I particularly really want you to think about, and you perhaps already have this in your minds, but I'm very keen for us to think about tackling the climate emergency and the ecological emergency that I've just set out very much together. That we kind of need this approach of both having, both having climate and ecological solutions. So what do I mean by that? Well, I'm talking about, if we think about, we need to plant more trees to tackle the carbon emissions issue, we need to think about where those trees go and make sure that we put them in the right place, which is at all achievable, but just needs careful thought. And we haven't done this in the past. In the past, we made much of planting significant conifer plantations in the 1950s on woodland that was actually ancient woodland, and ancient woodland was clear felled in order to plant conifer plantations in some areas, and we have since been spending a lot of time trying to restore those. So let's be kind of careful, but accept its emergency and take action, but be mindful about what we're doing and thoughtful about what we're doing. So think about the climate and the ecological emergency at the same time. Tackle the two together. And sometimes we're calling this a nature crisis or an ecological crisis, being a bit kind of, some people call it biodiversity crisis. I'm pretty happy with kind of any of those terminologies, really. What we found is that when we talk to people who perhaps aren't in the sector and aren't as knowledgeable perhaps as some of our members are and some of our supporters are, they don't necessarily understand what the word ecological means. I've had that feedback, but they do understand what nature is, and they kind of understand and resonate with the word nature. So increasingly in our kind of external communications, we're talking about nature and the nature crisis, because that seems to be something that really people kind of can understand and resonates with them, even when they're not directly involved in our sector. So how we're approaching this, to start off with, is we're really pressing for people and particular organisations to stand up and sort of declare the recognition that there is a nature crisis and a climate crisis. There's a ecological and climate emergency, and that these two are kind of inextricably linked and compound each other. And the more we kind of degrade our environment, the greater the impact that there will be on the climate crisis. So the two need to be seen hand in hand. And we've particularly recently focused our efforts around engaging the wider public in declaring this emergency. We've started to push Sheffield Council and to a lesser extent Rotherham Council around them also declaring, as well as their climate emergency, declaring an ecological emergency, so that they work on the two together hand in hand. And at present, Sheffield has not done that, and we still have sort of further conversations to have with Rotherham. We haven't quite got to that point, even that far with them as yet. So we've been very much talking and working with our community. We've been very keen and very supportive of this. And so far we're kind of pressing to declare a nature emergency on the 21st of May in Sheffield. So we're really encouraging people to sign up. And if you want to join that, then please do, and you can join that by going onto our website and looking under Nature Recovery, Nature Emergency on our website, and you can sign up to get more information. It tells you a bit more there about what we're trying to do. But of course, this, declaring it is just really a start point, and our ambition is to then take that into kind of a wider discussion with a lot more partners. At the minute, the emphasis is on kind of the community and the public as a whole, but there's a whole group of really key stakeholders that have a big impact on the natural environment, of course, local farmers and land managers, the Environment Agency, Yorkshire Water, those kind of organisations. And then there's businesses and sort of corporate organisations who perhaps are less aware of some of the impacts that their supplies and activities have on the natural environment around them, or indeed they might own small areas of land or have ownership or land management activities as part of their work, and there's opportunities there for them to help respond to this crisis as well. And very keen as well to think about the opportunity for children and young people to engage with this and have access to nature and natural play. So we're kind of working towards developing a nature recovery strategy for Sheffield, and in fact we're also working on it across South Yorkshire. I chair something called the Local Nature Partnership, and one of the things we're hoping to do is to bring together right across South Yorkshire a nature recovery strategy, and we're talking to the city region mayor's team about how this can be developed further as well. And part of this will be very much about shaping and developing a nature recovery network, which is a way of joining up all those fragmented pieces of land that I talked about right at the beginning. And how do we reconnect those sites? And we're looking at everything from trying to engage land managers and perhaps get them to think about different ways of doing something, right through to land purchase and how do we purchase more land to kind of fill in the gaps, where to connect the dots and join the dots so that we get this kind of much more resilient nature recovery network that we feel we really need, because there's a kind of opportunity here to really kind of counter some of the concerns that I've mentioned right at the start. So we're looking at how much land and water in Sheffield and Rotherham we can say is really great for nature. What percentage should there be? And there are discussions at a global level that will come through COP26 and the Climate Forum that will be talking about 30% and possibly 50% land for nature by 2050. And we're at Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust are thinking, well, should we have a target that we have 30% of land and water great for nature across Sheffield by 2030? That's where we want to start. So how can we bring land managers and landowners together to help achieve that? What does great for nature look like? And you know, how do we make sure that we monitor that we're really getting land in the right condition? We think we kind of want to identify some key species conservation plans. We've already got some of those in hand, but there's some more work to do, and think about how bold we want to be with those. And we are sort of talking about which species are important to reintroduce in terms of the positive impact they then have on the wider environment. Increase access to nature for all I mentioned, and we're looking at how we kind of reduce some of those impacts of intensive management, such as pesticide reduction targets, and thinking about things like you know, moorland, the approach to moorland fires and moorland burning, and that kind of intensive management that we see on our moorland areas. Actions on invasive species and increasing the environmental resilience, for instance, of woodlands by diversifying the species that are planted or regenerate. So there's lots of opportunities, lots of things to do that we want to pull together under this wider strategy and action plan. And the community has a real part to play in this, not only from a practical doing it in their own backyard point of view, but also from galvanising others and persuading politicians and landowners and businesses to help and play their part. And you know, we're looking to make this nature recovery network more bigger, better, more joined up, which is very much a phrase that Sir John Lawton used, and kind of really looking at the landscape at scale, not just in terms of our own land ownership, but looking right across the patch about how do we connect up land and allow for the support that wildlife needs to flourish in our local patch, even if it's a really small scale, you know, just improving the way we manage our road verges, like this on Bookham Parkway, or reintroducing cheese, and being bold about and brave, because I think one of the key things with this challenge is that we really need to think at a much bigger scale than we have done in the past, and really kind of join up our work much so it's has a much bigger impact across the area. So we can only do that really by working in partnership with others, and as I say, we're already doing some work to broaden those partnerships. There's a lot more work to do over the coming year to really kind of develop this strategy and work with the key partners, but we're also very keen to encourage the local community and general public to get involved, and particularly obviously want to support our members to act locally and think globally, and think about how they can help us achieve more for biodiversity and to help tackle the climate crisis. So I'm going to stop there, and I think what I'll do is I'll stop sharing my screen, and I think there's probably time for a few. I think I've seen the chat and the questions flashing, so hopefully there's a few people still with us on the call. We've still got a good few people here, so a little bit of time for some discussion and questions. And I hope it was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through what is a very big subject. I think you'll appreciate. But yes, if you want to, Rebecca, pull out some questions and see where we get to, then I will do my best to kind of manage the conversation or the question, answer the questions.
Thanks, Liz. So the first question we've got is, as well as potentially presenting an opportunity, to what extent is recently increased recreational use of the countryside a problem for our local wildlife?
Oh, it's a really good question. It is a challenge, and it's right to raise it. So I've kind of got two thoughts that we've been thinking about recently at the Trust. So one aspect is that it's fantastic that more people are enjoying our nature reserves, for example. I mean, we have done some work recently where we went out over one of the bank holidays and had staff and volunteers on site talking to a lot of the visitors. We had 1,000 people over one weekend at Wymingbrook Nature Reserve, just in that one weekend. So, you know, a lot of people kind of have discovered nature on their doorstep, which is fantastic. But actually, we also need to manage that and talk to people about how you approach visiting a nature reserve. And what we, you know, a classic example actually, I guess some of you will be dog owners, but actually one of the biggest challenges for wildlife is dogs off leads especially at ground nesting bird time. So basically, you know, a lot of our sites are really good for birds like skylark and curlew, and they are very disturbed by dogs because they are literally nesting on the ground. And so what we found was, if we just spoke to people on site and said, did you know that actually your dog off a lead is having a real impact on local wildlife, particularly some of the ground nesting birds, then people on the whole, 90% of the people on the whole put their dog on a lead when they were asked. Some people put their dog on a lead and then 5 minutes later, when they thought you weren't watching, took them off the lead again. But a majority of people just didn't really realise. They kind of knew about the impact of on lambs, but they didn't really realise about the impact on wildlife. And we've seen this at Redmires. I don't know if any of you know Redmires, lovely spot for wildlife. It has got a water vole population, and one of the things that we've done there is actually fence that population off from dogs, because we saw on social media people posting comments about, my dog loves to chase the rats up at Redmires, and I know that's like the last surviving population of water voles in South Yorkshire. So you know, we've got a job on our hands to educate and inform, and one of the things we're doing is trying to set up a volunteer ranger service, and if anyone's interested, please do get in touch. We're really looking for support and just looking for people who are willing to kind of get a bit of training and, you know, listen to some of the messages we want to portray, and then spend, you know, a couple of hours wandering around our nature reserves. Not a bad thing to do, and just telling people about some of the messages we need. And I think the flip side to that, positive side, is that I think there's a real space for natural play and natural play places, natural play parks. So the parks that we currently have that are very formal, or have swings or you know, children's play areas, that they're not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for places where children can kind of make their dens and you know, enjoy kind of picking some plants or learning about certain things, getting mucky, maybe being slightly destructive, and that's okay, because it's a natural play area. And I think there's a real opportunity for us to really designate natural play areas across Sheffield and Rotherham and say, actually, it's okay here, it's okay for you to kind of build dens and do stuff, and that's how you learn about nature. That's good.
Thank you. And the next question is, what are the implications of the recent Sheffield local election results and the change in the council for making a declaration of a nature emergency on May the 21st?
Have they actually decided what they're doing yet? I haven't heard. Have they decided? Oh, does somebody's nodding. Catherine's nodding. Somebody,
should we unmute her?
Can Catherine come off mute and tell me what's happened? I'm so excited if they actually decided.
You're still on mute, Catherine.
Oh, well, it looks like she might be typing in.
Oh, okay.
Okay, well, oh, Catherine, go for it, Catherine. Can you tell us more?
Change.
Oh, okay. I thought you were okay. So yes, there's obviously change. There's change in the fact that it's going from, you know, hopefully it's going to move from leader to committee system, and it's going to move from obviously there's no overall control at the minute. That's the bit that I'm still kind of what's going to happen. I think there's real opportunity because you know, the Labour councillors were not responding to our request. There was some reticence about that. I think they had some valid reasons. They had some concerns about what that meant and how they would deliver on it. But I can't imagine that having more Green councillors and more Liberal Democrats across Sheffield is going to make it harder for us to get a declaration of a nature emergency. So I really hope the council will join with us, whichever kind of party or colour party ends up being in part of the controlling group. I really hope now that be it Labour and a mixture of others or whatever, that they will really feel that there is a real interest in nature and the green issues that we're talking about. So optimistic.
The next question feeds into that. So are the local authorities on board with the plan for nature and the need for connectivity between areas of woodland and green areas? And is this reflected in planning permission granted on development sites?
In short, no. But we're working on it, and there are some positive signs. So obviously Sheffield local plan, Rotherham local plan has been done, but there are still opportunities with Rotherham because it has a lot more rural areas, and I think Rotherham's really interesting actually because there's a lot of land that we could potentially convert into much better land for nature. So there's a real opportunity to step change in Rotherham by kind of converting land from certain kind of poorer farmland into really good land for nature. And then in Sheffield, we're in a very kind of interesting time with the local plan, because now is the time to influence the local plan. And if you are at all interested in nature, then please do get involved in the local plan consultations when they come out. And at the minute, you know, the process is at that time where it's looking at which sites are developed and which ones aren't. And we are trying to influence the council, and will be trying to influence them with Nature Recovery Network maps to say that these areas should be really protected. They're really critical for nature, and we really kind of want to try and stop development on those sites that really, you know, could be quite critical for connecting up corridors and that fragmented landscape. And there are good signs about the council actually getting information from landowners about baseline biodiversity before they consider allocating a site, which is the issue with Althorpe, where it's been allocated for 30 years and just everyone's sort of forgotten what it was like and thought it was a boring agricultural field, but now is turned into this kind of wildlife hotspot, and no one at Sheffield City Council kind of has realised that until too late, really. So yeah, it now is a really critical time in Sheffield to influence what happens with land through the local plan. So do keep an eye out for that.
I'll pick a couple more questions out because we're running out of time now, but I think we might have time for one or two more. But The reintroduction of species can really capture the imagination of the public and their support. Are there any plans for our area? For example, Nottingham are close to reintroducing beavers, which will really benefit ecosystems and flood defences.
Yeah, so we have been exploring reintroduction of beaver. There's quite a lot of work still to do on that. There was quite a small study area looked at, and I think the result of that really was that actually we would be better looking across a much bigger study area. And it is it's also quite it does capture the imagination, but it is quite expensive as well. So we need to make sure that we, you know, do it properly and that we have the full funding that we need to do it. But yeah, we're very keen to look at reintroduction of beaver. You know, some of the things I've talked about are just like trying to think about some of the species that we're kind of almost losing. You know, how do we keep some of those species like waterfowl and white-clawed crayfish? You know, are we kind of more interested in beavers because they're new and shiny, or, you know, what about some of the species we're losing? So we've got some things to think about quite carefully, and we'd like to have a more kind of public conversation about that across Sheffield and Rotherham, about which species we kind of really value and what we want to reintroduce. And you know, beaver is the species of the moment, and for many good reasons, and natural flood risk management is one of them. But yeah, it'd be good to kind of think of it much more in the round as well, and think about other species that we've kind of lost or we're seeing declining, and what we can do to sort of help them to flourish and expand.
Thanks, Liz. And probably the last one now is, do you favour active intervention as opposed to natural facilitated regeneration, for example, tree planting?
Okay, so it depends is the short answer. Basically, it depends on the site. So wherever possible, I personally think natural regeneration is the best thing. It takes more time, but it means that the species that regenerate are likely to be more resilient and stronger. They don't require staking, they don't require plastic tubes, they don't require loads of people power to put in. They just kind of do their thing, and it's a much more natural extension. So for example, where you've got an existing semi-natural ancient woodland, if you've got the opportunity adjacent to that to just allow some of that expansion from that core woodland, that to me is the ideal scenario. And also because whilst tree planting is needed, we just don't have enough tree stock to actually plant for the kind of scale of ambition that, for example, the government are talking about. That the number of trees that's required is phenomenal. And a lot of, you know, you can get really high percentages when you plant. You can get a really high percentage that fail, which is just a complete waste of money as well. So I think, you know, let's use tree planting where we have to, but where there's opportunity to kind of get that tone between woodland and field, we call it ecotone, then, you know, we should just try and help make that happen by taking off stock or fencing off areas and just allowing it to happen naturally. It's much more cost effective and probably much more resilient.
That's brilliant. We do have one last question, which I feel bad if we don't answer it. We've answered all the others. Are there any regions or other cities where nature recovery networks are already working well?
Okay, so this is quite new, and we are waiting for a little bit, to some extent. The Environment Bill actually would really help us. So if the government can kind of pull its finger out and get on with that, that would be great. And you know, some of you will probably have helped kind of write to MPs, and in the future, if you hear from us and we say, please write to your MP, ask them for the Environment Bill, please do help us do that, because the Environment Bill is one way of really getting nature recovery networks and nature recovery strategies delivered, because it's in that legislation. At the minute, it's perhaps not as strong as we would like, but it is in there, and it would put an onus on every local authority to do a nature recovery strategy, which is, you know, which would be fantastic. So Sheffield City Council wouldn't be asking them, they would have to do it by law. And we would be making them do it better than perhaps the baseline. We might try and help them achieve a Rolls-Royce version as opposed to a Reliant Robin version, but they would still have to do it. So there's a real opportunity with the Environment Bill. So please do talk to your MPs about that if you get the opportunity. But we are pretty well ahead, actually. So because we're kind of really keen on this work around this nature recovery network, South Yorkshire Local Nature Partnership, which is kind of across the sector, have been working with the mayoral combined authority, and we, you know, the mayor has actually been quite supportive of this, which has been really good to see. And we now are imminently awaiting for some nature recovery network maps, which will be kind of the data that gives us an indication of where the actual best location spatially across Sheffield, Rotherham, Doncaster and Barnsley is for a nature recovery network. And we then need to kind of interpret that, look at it on the ground, make sure it kind of fits. But it's a really good step forward, and we're probably one of the few in the country that are drawing together nature recovery networks and natural capital, and it's really quite exciting. And I know that others in, for example, the rest of Yorkshire, I talked to kind of people in the other kind of now combined authorities or mayoral areas, and they're really kind of looking at South Yorkshire and seeing what we're doing, and we are seen as kind of forging ahead. So I think in terms of cities, I'd say Bristol declared a climate and nature emergency about a year or more ago. They're doing some quite interesting things, but they declared it and then it's gone a little bit quiet. I think the challenge is to declare it, but we, you know, declaring it is minor. It's just accepting and getting people on board. What we really need to do then is to take action collectively, because otherwise it's kind of pointless declaring it. So yeah, we need people to join with us, and I think Sheffield and Rotherham's in a really good place to do that. And with all of you on this call, I really hope that you'll help make that happen.
Thank you, Liz. That's been really insightful and really inspiring. And thank you everyone for coming, and thank you all for being members of the Trust, because without you, we couldn't do everything that we do to help wildlife and nature across Sheffield and Rotherham. So a big thank you to all of you. For those of you asking about the nature emergency in Sheffield, which we're declaring on the 21st of May, and we are hosting an event on Thursday evening as part of the Festival of Debate, and we'll send all the information in an email about how you can get involved with that, or if you want to attend the event. So we'll send all that out on an email for you as well, so you've got all the information, and you can also find it on our website as well. So thank you very much for coming, and we hope to see you all out and about very soon.